Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and the goal of this video is to kind of give you all the tips on troubleshooting Heroku deployment. Because oftentimes, especially if you're really a developer of any kind, you might be using Heroku to deploy your apps, and you can do a lot with Heroku, and it can sometimes be daunting to kind of know where to look. So this is going to be a little bit also a primer on like how Heroku works, so that way you can understand how to troubleshoot your apps. So step number one. Okay, if you have an app, there's a couple possible errors. There are build errors. So that means, so essentially the way Heroku works is that when it first loads up your repo, your repository of code, it's going to look for different markers that'll tell it that, hey, this is a Ruby application or a Python application or a Node application. So if it sees a package.json at the top level of the application, then it's going to be like, okay, this is a Node app. Let me go do Node stuff. So first off, it's initially going to be looking at the top level of your repo. So a mistake a lot of people will do is that in their repo, let's say it's a Node project, instead of having like the very top of the repo be where the package.json is, they'll put their whole project in a folder, and now they have their project in a subfolder. So the package.json is not at the top level of the repo, or the requirements.txt, or the gem file, or the composer.json, whatever the file is, needs to be at that top level, because it's not going to go look in the subdirectories. You could configure that, but then you're making your life a lot more harder than it needs to be. Okay, so we really want to make sure that your repo represents your project, and then that those files at the very top level of your repo. So just to kind of show you an example, if I go to my GitHub, and let me see if I can just find like a good example. Let me just type in backend. Okay, Ringo to use backend. Let's take a look. This is a Ruby backend. So notice like the gem. See, this is the top layer of my repo, and see, there's the gem file. That's what it's going to look at for Ruby. Okay, or let me see if I can find a Node one. 1207 docs backend. Let's check that one. So see, this is a Node one. See, the package.json's at the top level. If I open up your repo and I see a folder and then everything's inside that folder, it's not going to deploy right. So that's typical problem number one. Other issue is, one, you forget to do what's called a proc file. Now, for a lot of situations, you don't necessarily need a proc file. A proc file is a file that's like uppercase PROC, so it's literally spelled PROC file. Okay, and that's it, no extension. And this is a file that tells Heroku that when it's done building your app, what command should it run. So usually if you're building a web application, you're going to see something like web, and then you put like, let's say for Node, it'd be like npm start. So for Node, it's going to assume that npm starts the command that you want to run. So you don't have to worry about that one. But what if it's something else? Then you need to make sure you specify that. Okay. But that proc file being there can sometimes be really important, because there are certain frameworks where kind of Heroku knows like what it needs to do. So like Rails, you probably don't need to worry about it because it'll just know what to do. But otherwise, it won't know what program to run. So again, there's the proc file, there's the package.json. I mean, not package.json, but making sure that file's at the top of your repo, the gem file, the package.json, the composer.json, the cargo.toml, whatever it is. But you can also see here whether, when you upload the app, whether it built correctly or not. So you'll see here it says like a view build log. The build log will show you what Heroku was doing when it was building out your app. So oftentimes if the build fails, read here. Oftentimes it'll actually make suggested solutions. Okay, now if that fails, sometimes you may want to, it's probably gonna be that proc file, or you're missing something with the way you set up your files. But also another good resource is to look up the actual build pack. So the way Heroku works is that it's going to identify what type of project you're making, whether it's a PHP project, a Ruby project, a Rails project, and it's going to look for the proper language and then use what's called a build pack, which is like these automated scripts that tell it how to set up a project of that type. So that way you don't have to go through all those complications. Okay, so if I was like worrying about PHP, I'd be like, I would look up the PHP Heroku build pack. And there are custom build packs out there. And you can use custom build packs. We're not going to cross that bridge here. What we're going to care about are the ones that Heroku kind of automatically uses. Okay, usually you can find, you'll find the details. So if you just Google it, like build pack for PHP, build pack for Ruby, build pack for Node, you'll find the details, and then you can read through this, and it'll explain to you like what files is it looking for, what environmental variables can I pass in, so forth and so forth and so forth. Okay, so worth reading to make sure that you are using your build pack correctly. So that way, no matter like what PHP project, because a lot of times you'll learn how to do things with like one particular framework in that language, but you could use it theoretically for any framework in that language, because the build pack is there to deploy the language, not necessarily that framework. So if you know how the build pack works, you can structure any project for that language to deploy successfully. Okay, but let's say your build is successful. So you see here it says build succeeded, but the app is still not working. There could be a variety of possible things. The first thing I'd probably check is going to be here in settings. I want to be looking at my config vars, okay? Because oftentimes you're going to need, basically you are probably putting in a lot of sensitive variables in a .env file locally, okay, locally on your computer. But if you're doing your security stuff right, then that should be Git ignored and not being uploaded to Git. So your .env file is not on Git, so that's not going to be available to your application. Okay, so generally all the variables that you define in your .env file would be defined here in your config vars, and they would work exactly the same. Okay, so you would access them through the environmental variable hash in Ruby, or through the process.env in Node, or you have to use like the os.env.get in Python to get these variables. Okay, but oftentimes a lot of people forget they need to set those environmental variables that they're using locally here in the application, so that way their app works. So go take a look. Hey, do you have a .env file? What variables are in that .env file? Make sure you define them here. Okay, and another important point to notice, there is no port variable that's defined here, but your application does need to use the port environmental variable. It's spelled uppercase P-O-R-T. So wherever, like if you're doing a web application and you're binding to a web port, so like port 3000, port 4000, you don't actually want to set a specific number. You want to use this port variable. However you use environmental variables in that language, you would want to use that, because what's going to happen is that when you do a web application with Heroku, it's going to assign you a random port number. And if your application doesn't listen to that port number, it won't work. Okay, so the build may succeed, but it's not going to run. You'll see like an error. It'll say like failed. So basically in that case, you'll get a runtime error. And then where you'll see runtime errors, if you go to overview, okay, you click over here on more, you'll see here view logs. So build logs are like when they build the app. Then the app runs, and you'll see the runtime logs here in view logs. Now the only issue with this is that it's going to show you sort of like a limited amount of logs. It's been a long time since this particular application ran, so it might take a while for it to load up. But what you want to do is reopen the app and like try to do whatever thing isn't working again, so that way the output opens here. So one thing I like to do is I'll restart the app. So what I'll do here is I'll click on restart all dynos. Like this is the same thing as restarting your server locally. Okay, and what that does is going to turn on the app. So see, it's turning on the app, and you start getting all the output again. So because often the error is actually when the server starts up, so I can catch that error here. Okay, so I can see here, see it's binding to port 15549. That's the port that Heroku assigned to it, because I made sure to set up the app to bind to that port variable. Okay, but again, I would see this error here, it would say like failed to bind to port whatever. So again, this is going to be a good place to find errors, because all the logs you would normally look at locally will be visible here when your app is deployed, and you can kind of determine what the problem is. And again, generally you might not see anything here, so what I would do is I would restart the app, which you can do by clicking right here. Okay. Again, also other thing, maybe you need to go. You might have been using your local database, like you have your own local Postgres server running on your computer, but when you're on Heroku, you need to use the actual like online database. So you can go here to the resources tab to deploy a database of some sort, and again, make sure that it should make a config variable called database URL. So that means your code would have to pull in from that environmental variable the URL for the database. So these are things just to kind of keep in mind. Cool. So those should address like most of the typical issues. Again, if you read the build logs, or you read the runtime logs, Okay, you should be able to kind of figure out most errors. Another typical error is that people migrate their apps locally. So you're using like Django or Ruby on Rails or Laravel, and you've created your migrations and you ran your migrations locally on your local computer. But again, you're using a different database often when you deploy it to Heroku, so you have to run those migrations again. So if you want to run a command, you could use the Heroku CLI, but if you don't have this Heroku CLI, you can click Run Console right here, and you can run commands. So like if it Rails, it'd be like Rails the DB migrate to migrate the database. Okay, if it was like Django, I'd be like Python manage.py migrate. Whatever the command is for your particular application, you can actually run those commands here to run those migrations, so that way the table is all the database is all set up for you. Okay, generally you don't have to worry about that with Mongo databases since they're schemaless, so those should kind of pretty much work out of the box. Yay, MongoDB. Yeah, so this should help troubleshoot many of the issues you might have when you're deploying a Heroku app, or at least give you some guidelines on like where to look for answers. Again, reading the build pack documentation, making sure that all your environmental variables are set, reading the build logs, reading the logs, to kind of determine what's going on. And again, if you're wondering what command it's running to start your app, usually you'll find it over here. So you see here it says, web gunicorn to do project. That's the command it's running to start up my app. Okay, so again, that's what you would define in the proc file. So if it doesn't have a proc file, usually the build pack will have something, it defaults to something. Another issue is that under deploy, like I usually deploy by connecting my GitHub. A lot of people also deploy using the CLI. But another mistake a lot of people make is that they may commit their new changes to their code, but their code isn't reflected on Heroku because either A, they didn't push it to GitHub, if you're using the GitHub method. So if it doesn't push to GitHub, and then even if they do push it to GitHub, if you don't have automatic deploys enabled, it won't automatically update Heroku when you push to GitHub. So keep that in mind. Or if you're using the CLI method, you push to GitHub, but you forget to push to Heroku because then you push to Heroku separately. So if you forget to do that, then Heroku doesn't know the code has been updated to redeploy and update your code. So those are other things that are sort of like typical mistakes. So hopefully with all this kind of gives you a guideline on sort of how to address issues with Heroku. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.